On the morning of August 19, 1942, as the sun rose over the English Channel, the French coastal town of Dieppe was transformed into a slaughterhouse. Within 9 hours, a force of over 6,000 Allied soldiers, the vast majority of them young Canadians who had spent 3 restless years training in the rain-soaked fields of Britain, found themselves pinned against a wall of flint pebbles, exposed to a murderous crossfire of German machine guns and heavy artillery. By mid-afternoon, more than 3,300 men lay dead, wounded, or captured. The water at the shore ran deep red with blood, and the Pebble beach was choked with the smoking, shattered hulls of amphibious tanks that had never managed to climb more than a few yards beyond the tide line. It was the highest single-day casualty rate suffered by Western Allied forces in the European theater of the entire Second World War. To the public reading the carefully sanitized news reports in London, Ottawa, and Washington the following day, Dieppe was framed as a daring reconnaissance in force, a necessary test of the formidable German coastal defenses known as the Atlantic Wall. It was portrayed as a heroic sacrifice that yielded invaluable lessons for the ultimate liberation of Europe. But behind closed doors in the halls of Allied High Command, a far darker and more disturbing reality was known to those who had planned the assault. The raid on Dieppe had not been an unforeseen tactical tragedy caused by bad luck or bad weather. It was an operation that had been warned against by senior commanders, an operation whose core assumptions were known to be flawed before a single boat launched, and an operation that was revived after being officially cancelled, pushed forward by political ambition, bureaucratic momentum, and a desperate desire to prove that Britain could strike back at the heart of occupied Europe. To understand how 6,000 men were sent into a textbook defensive kill zone on a summer morning in 1942, one must look not at the French coast, but into the pressure cooker of Allied grand strategy in the summer of 1942. The Second World War was at its most perilous inflection point. In the east, the German Wehrmacht was rolling across the Soviet Union in Operation Blue, driving relentlessly toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial center of Stalingrad. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, was watching his armies suffer millions of casualties and losing vast swaths of his nation's industrial heartland. Stalin was relentless in his demands to the Western Allies, insisting that Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt open a second front in Western Europe immediately. Stalin made it clear in telegram after telegram that if the Western Allies did not launch a major invasion of Western Europe in 1942 to draw dozens of German divisions away from the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union might not survive the weight of the German onslaught. For Winston Churchill, Stalin's demands presented a terrifying dilemma. Churchill knew better than anyone the catastrophic danger of a failed cross-channel invasion. Memories of the slaughter on the Western Front in the First World War haunted him, as did the lingering shadow of the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in 1915, a grand naval and amphibious operation that Churchill himself had championed, which ended in devastating Allied slaughter on the beaches of Turkey. Churchill knew that in 1942, the Western Allies simply did not possess the landing craft, the shipping capacity, the air superiority, or the trained divisions necessary to land in France and hold a permanent beachhead against the battle-hardened Wehrmacht. The American military leadership, led by General George C. Marshall, was eager to invade France as early as possible, pushing for a limited invasion codenamed Operation Sledgehammer in late 1942. Churchill spent months fighting a subtle, exhausting diplomatic battle to convince the Americans that a premature invasion of France would lead to an Allied disaster so profound it could lose the war. Yet, Churchill could not simply say no and do nothing. The political pressure from Moscow was overwhelming, and the British public, frustrated by years of retreats and defensive warfare, was growing restless. Banners demanding a second front now were being painted on the walls of London buildings. Churchill needed a way to demonstrate to Stalin, to the Americans, and to his own people that Great Britain was actively fighting on the European continent. He needed a middle ground, something larger than a hit-and-run commando raid, but smaller than a full-scale invasion. He needed an operation that would satisfy the political demand for action, test the feasibility of capturing a heavily fortified enemy port, and gather critical intelligence on German defensive capabilities along the Channel coast. Enter Combined Operations Headquarters, a specialized military organization created shortly after the evacuation from Dunkirk to develop innovative tactics, equipment, and raid strategies for amphibious warfare. At the helm of Combined Operations was a man whose personality and ambition would come to shape the entire trajectory of the raid, Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a charismatic, handsome, and impeccably connected naval officer who possessed an unmatched ability to navigate the highest corridors of British political and military power. He was young, dynamic, and favored by Churchill, who saw in Mountbatten the kind of aggressive, forward-thinking leader who could bring flair and audacity to Britain's war effort. Under Mountbatten, Combined Operations had conducted several successful small-scale raids, most notably the audacious raid on Saint-Nazaire in March 1942, where an old British destroyer packed with explosives was rammed into a German dry dock, neutralizing the only port on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing the giant German battleship Tirpitz. That success had elevated Mountbatten's profile and granted Combined Operations immense prestige and influence within the defense establishment. Mountbatten wanted to prove that his organization was capable of executing far larger, more complex military maneuvers. He envisioned a large-scale divisional raid on a fortified French coastal town, a plan that would test the ability of naval, land, and air forces to operate together in a coordinated, modern assault. The target selected for this ambitious experiment was Dieppe, a picturesque seaside resort town on the coast of Normandy, framed by towering, sheer chalk cliffs and featuring a wide, open beach facing the English Channel. The choice of Dieppe was driven by strategic logic. It was within range of British fighter cover from airfields in southern England, making it possible for the Royal Air Force to provide air support throughout the operation. Furthermore, Dieppe possessed a functional harbor, which Allied planners believed was essential to capture intact if a future invasion force was ever to be resupplied from the sea. The original operational plan, developed in the late spring of 1942, was codenamed Operation Rudder. The core objective of Rudder was to land a reinforced division on the coast, seize the town and harbor of Dieppe, hold the perimeter for a single day, destroy enemy coastal batteries, dock installations, and radar stations, and then systematically evacuate the entire force back to England by sea. It was designed as a temporary strike, a raid on a massive scale rather than a permanent conquest. But as the planning for Operation Rudder progressed throughout May and June of 1942, the tactical assumptions upon which the operation rested began to unravel under scrutiny from senior military commanders who voiced deep, fundamental concerns. The plan for Rudder originally relied on two essential components to ensure success against a fortified coastal town: heavy naval bombardment to suppress enemy defensive positions before soldiers set foot on the beach, and heavy aerial bombardment by RAF bomber formations to destroy enemy strongpoints, communications, and artillery emplacements overlooking the landing zones. But almost immediately, friction arose among the service branches. The Royal Navy, cautious of risking its capital ships in the narrow, shallow waters of the English Channel, where they would be vulnerable to German U-boats and Luftwaffe dive bombers, refused to provide battleships or heavy cruisers for naval gunfire support. They offered only small destroyers equipped with 4-inch guns, weapons that were utterly incapable of penetrating concrete bunkers or heavy coastal artillery casemates. Simultaneously, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command, flatly refused to commit heavy bombers to a pre-invasion carpet bombing of Dieppe. Portal argued that carpet bombing would transform the streets of Dieppe into piles of rubble, blocking the town's narrow roadways and preventing Allied tanks from advancing inland from the beach. Furthermore, there were grave concerns about civilian casualties among the French population, which Allied command was desperate to avoid for political reasons. With those two decisions, the critical fire support that any amphibious assault against a fortified position required was effectively stripped away. The landing forces were expected to hit a heavily defended shore without the benefit of heavy naval shells or heavy aerial bombs to daze and suppress the defenders. Senior commanders within the British military hierarchy began to express severe misgivings. General Bernard Montgomery, who was then serving as Commander-in-Chief of Southeastern Command and was initially involved in the oversight of Rudder, reviewed the plan and recognized its inherent flaws. Montgomery argued that an amphibious assault directly against a heavily fortified port was inherently dangerous, and that if the initial element of complete tactical surprise was lost, the entire operation would degenerate into a slaughter. Montgomery strongly recommended that if the landing forces could not be guaranteed immediate, overwhelming firepower support, the operation should be abandoned entirely. Despite these warnings, training for Operation Rudder proceeded throughout June 1942. The troops selected to carry out the assault were the men of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Major General J.H. Roberts. The Canadians had been stationed in Great Britain for years, enduring endless cycles of training maneuvers, coastal defense duties, and mock exercises. Their morale was high, but their desire for real action was intense. Both the Canadian public and the Canadian government in Ottawa were putting immense pressure on British High Command to get Canadian troops into the fighting. They did not want their soldiers to remain passive spectators in Britain while British and Commonwealth forces fought in North Africa and Asia. By early July 1942, the men of the 2nd Canadian Division were embarked on troop ships in the south of England, fully briefed and ready to sail across the Channel for Operation Rudder. But then, nature intervened. A series of severe summer storms battered the English Channel, making an amphibious landing impossible. Day after day, the ships sat at anchor in the Solent, their troops cooped up below deck, while the weather showed no sign of clearing. With thousands of soldiers having been fully briefed on the target, the risk of operational security being compromised grew by the hour. On July 7, 1942, High Command made the sensible, formal decision. Operation Rudder was officially canceled. The troops were disembarked, returned to their camps, and instructed to forget the details of the mission. Under normal military procedure, a major operation that had been officially canceled, whose security had been potentially compromised by thousands of men knowing its target, should have been permanently buried. But in the midsummer of 1942, the political and strategic pressures that had birthed Rudder had not disappeared. They had intensified. Stalin was pressing harder than ever for a second front. Churchill was under pressure to deliver a blow in Europe before the year ended. And within combined operations, Lord Louis Mountbatten was unwilling to let months of preparation, resources, and institutional prestige vanish without result. In late July, Mountbatten made a controversial decision that would later become one of the most fiercely debated choices of the war. He decided to revive the raid on Dieppe on his own authority, bypassing the standard formal approval channels of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. The revived operation was given a new code name, Operation Jubilee. The tactical plan for Operation Jubilee was virtually identical to the cancelled Operation Rudder, with only minor modifications. It still lacked heavy naval gunfire support. It still lacked heavy aerial bombardment. It still relied on an ambitious, rigid timetable that required multiple landings across several distinct beaches to occur with absolute precision in the dark and at dawn. But now, the operation suffered from a fatal addition. It was resurrected after security had already been exposed to thousands of men, under the assumption that the Germans would never expect the Allies to attempt a raid on a target that had been so recently abandoned. What Allied planners failed to fully appreciate or chose to ignore, was the reality of the German defenses at Dieppe. The town was defended by the German 110th Infantry Regiment, part of the 302nd Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Konrad Hasse. The German troops were not raw recruits. They were well-trained, highly organized, and positioned in defensive emplacements that made full use of Dieppe's formidable natural geography. Dieppe's beach was framed on both sides by high, steep chalk cliffs, the West Headland and the East Headland. German engineers had spent months transforming these cliffs into fortress walls. Deep inside the soft chalk, they had excavated concealed gun positions, heavy machine gun nests, mortar pits, and artillery casemates protected by thick, reinforced concrete. These positions were carefully sited so that their fields of fire overlapped across the entire length of the beach and the harbor entrance. Every square foot of the open, gravelly beach was covered by pre-sighted weapons. Interlocking fields of fire meant that any force attempting to land on the shore would walk straight into a lethal grid of machine gun fire, heavy mortar blasts, and high-velocity anti-tank artillery. Furthermore, the physical nature of the beach itself was a defensive barrier that Allied intelligence had disastrously misjudged. The shore at Dieppe was not composed of fine, firm sand, but of millions of smooth, rounded flint stones, known as chert pebbles. To a soldier running on foot, these loose pebbles were like walking on rolling ball bearings, causing men to slip, fall, and exhaust themselves instantly under heavy gear. To an armored vehicle, the pebbles were even worse. When a heavy tank drove onto the pebble beach, the loose stones would grind into the tank tracks, jamming the drive sprockets or causing the tracks to slip entirely, leaving the multi-ton iron war machines immobilized on the water's edge, sitting targets for enemy gunners. Allied intelligence had collected samples of the beach before the raid, but senior planners either overlooked or underestimated the physical threat these pebbles posed to armored mobility. They built their entire tactical concept on the assumption that Canadian Churchill tanks, landed directly onto the main beach from specialized landing craft, would drive off the pebble shore, breach the concrete seawall, enter the town, and provide mobile fire support for the infantry. It was an assumption that would prove fatal within minutes of the assault. In the early morning hours of August 19, 1942, a fleet of over 230 vessels, ranging from small wooden landing craft to destroyers, departed the English coast, steaming quietly across the black waters of the Channel toward Normandy. On board were over 4,900 Canadian soldiers, over 1,000 British commandos, and a small detachment of 50 United States Army Rangers, the first American land forces to see combat in Europe during the war. The operational plan for Jubilee called for a series of coordinated landings. Before the main assault could hit the central beach directly in front of Dieppe, 4 flank landings were scheduled to take place at dawn on beaches to the east and west of the town. The goal of these flank attacks was to capture and neutralize the German coastal artillery batteries situated on the high cliffs, batteries that could otherwise rain destructive fire down upon the main landing force on the central beach. To the far west, at Varengeville, British No. 4 Commando, led by the charismatic Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovett, executed a masterclass in amphibious warfare. Landing silently, moving rapidly through woods and ravines, and coordinating their attack with precision, Lovett's commandos scaled the steep cliffs, outflanked the German gun positions of the Hesse battery, destroyed the heavy coastal artillery, and withdrew with minimal casualties. It was the single complete tactical success of the entire operation, proving that well-trained, flexible light forces operating with surprise could achieve their objectives. Everywhere else along the French coast, however, the plan descended into chaos and catastrophe. To the far east, at Berneval, the landing force composed of British No. 3 Commando ran into a German armed coastal convoy while steaming toward the shore in the dark. A brief, violent night sea battle erupted. Although the British destroyers repelled the German craft, the element of surprise was completely lost. Tracers lit up the night sky, and sirens began wailing along the French coastline. German troops on the cliffs were alerted, taking up their firing positions long before the landing craft reached the beach. When the commandos touched down at Berneval, they were met by heavy machine gun and artillery fire. Only a single landing craft carrying 20 men managed to land unobserved in a small gully. Though they fought heroically and harassed the German gunners with rifle fire, they lacked the numbers to destroy the battery. Meanwhile, on the inner flank landings, the Canadian regiments met relentless resistance. At Puys, just a mile east of Dieppe, the Royal Regiment of Canada was tasked with securing the east headland overlooking the main harbor, but their landing craft were delayed in the darkness, arriving 20 minutes late. By the time the Canadian ramps dropped, the sun was rising, and the German defenders on the cliffs were fully alert, waiting behind concrete walls and razor wire. As the Canadian soldiers scrambled off the landing craft onto the narrow pebble beach at Puys, they were met by an absolute wall of fire. Heavy machine guns positioned on the cliffs above fired down directly into the packed ranks of troops. Mortars rained down upon the water's edge. Men were cut down by the dozen before they could take 10 steps. A high concrete seawall at the rear of the beach was topped with thick coils of barbed wire, trapping the surviving soldiers on a strip of pebble stone no wider than a few dozen yards. Within minutes, the beach at Puys had become an open-air slaughterhouse. Officers were killed almost instantly. Radio communications were destroyed, and soldiers squeezed themselves against the cold concrete wall, trying in vain to find shelter from the relentless fire raining down from above. Of the more than 500 Canadians who landed at Puys, over 200 were killed, and nearly 300 were wounded or captured. Only a tiny fraction ever returned to England. To the west of Dieppe, at Pourville, the South Saskatchewan Regiment and the Cameron Highlanders of Canada landed with initial tactical surprise. They managed to push inland across a bridge over the Ski River, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Merritt, who walked openly across the bullet-swept bridge under heavy fire, waving his helmet and shouting to his men, "Come on over, there's nothing to worry about." Merritt's legendary bravery earned him the Victoria Cross, but even his courage could not overcome the defensive reality. German reinforcements quickly counterattacked, pinning the Canadians down and forcing them back toward the beach. Despite the fact that the flank attacks at Puys and Berneval had failed to silence the heavy defenses on the cliffs, the main assault on Dieppe's central beach went ahead precisely on schedule at 5:20 a.m. The main assault was led by two distinguished Canadian units, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment. As their landing craft charged through the surf toward the long, gray pebble shore in front of the town, 4 British destroyers opened fire with their 4-inch guns, while RAF Hurricane fighters swept low over the beach, firing cannon rounds and laying smoke screens to conceal the landing. But 4-inch naval shells and fighter cannon rounds were useless against concrete bunkers. The moment the smoke screens dissipated, the German gunners on both the east and west headlands opened fire. The main beach at Dieppe became an inferno. German heavy machine guns, firing from concealed positions on the flanks, swept the beach with crossfire. High-explosive mortar shells burst continuously on the pebbled shore, sending razor-sharp fragments of iron and flint flying through the air. Canadian soldiers leaped off the landing craft ramps, only to be cut down in the shallow water. Those who reached the beach found themselves running on loose, shifting pebbles that sucked at their boots, slowing their movement to a crawl while exposed to an unceasing barrage of fire. Minutes after the infantry landed, the specialized armor of the 14th Army Tank Regiment, the Calgary Regiment, arrived on the shore aboard specialized tank landing craft. The heavy Churchill tanks rumbled off the ramps directly into the surf, their tracks churning up the loose, rolling stones. The physical threat of the beach immediately manifested itself. The loose flint pebbles ground into the heavy iron track links, stripping the tracks off the drive sprockets and jamming the steering mechanisms. Tank after tank became immobilized on the water's edge, their engines roaring uselessly as their tracks spun uselessly in the pebbles. Of the 29 Churchill tanks that managed to land on the beach, many were instantly immobilized by the pebbles or destroyed by high-velocity anti-tank guns positioned in concrete casemates along the promenade. A few tanks managed to claw their way up the beach, climb over the concrete seawall, and reach the wide paved promenade in front of the town. But once on the promenade, they found their path into the streets of Dieppe blocked by massive, reinforced concrete anti-tank barriers that German engineers had built across every single street opening. Lacking specialized demolition engineers, most of whom had been killed on the beach, the tanks could not penetrate the town. They drove back and forth along the promenade, firing their cannon at German positions in the hotels and casino, providing heroic cover for the infantry, but unable to alter the outcome of the battle. Aboard the command ship HMS Calpe, miles out at sea, Major General J.H. Roberts and Admiral Mountbatten were attempting to direct a battle they could not see. The thick smoke screens laid across the beach, combined with the chaotic roar of artillery and the destruction of most Army radio equipment, meant that the command ship was receiving almost no accurate information from the shore. Signals were fragmentary, confused, and dangerously out of date. At 6:30 a.m., General Roberts received a mistaken signal suggesting that elements of the Essex Scottish Regiment had successfully broken through the defenses, entered the town, and were clearing the streets. Believing that a breakthrough was occurring and that the town was on the verge of being captured, Roberts made a tragic decision. He committed his floating reserve, the Les Fusiliers de Mont-Royal, a French-Canadian regiment, into the central beach to reinforce the imaginary advance. The French-Canadian soldiers were loaded into unarmored wooden landing craft and sent straight into the center of the kill zone. As their boats approached the shore, German machine gunners on the cliffs, who had run low on ammunition, were resupplied and opened fire on the fresh wave of landing craft. The wooden boats were splintered by heavy fire. When the Fusiliers jumped onto the beach, they discovered there was no breakthrough, no entry into the town, and no cover. They were simply added to the hundreds of wounded and pinned down soldiers huddled against the seawall, trapped on the pebbles under a sky filled with flying metal. While the slaughter continued on the ground, a massive air battle was raging above the English Channel. The Royal Air Force had committed nearly 70 squadrons of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Typhoons to protect the fleet and engage the German Luftwaffe. The RAF leadership had hoped that Operation Jubilee would draw the Luftwaffe into a decisive, large-scale air battle where British fighters could inflict heavy losses on the German Air Force. But the Luftwaffe responded with disciplined, lethal efficiency. German fighters from Jagdgeschwader 2 and Jagdgeschwader 26 attacked the Allied air formations relentlessly. By the end of the day, the RAF had lost 106 aircraft, the highest single-day loss suffered by the Royal Air Force during the entire war, compared to just 48 German aircraft destroyed. The battle for air superiority, like the battle on the beach, had ended in a clear victory for the German defenders. By 9 a.m., it was painfully clear to every officer on the beach that the operation was a total catastrophe. There was no hope of capturing the town, no hope of destroying the coastal artillery, and no hope of holding a perimeter. The only goal now was survival and evacuation. At 11 a.m., the signal was finally given from HMS Calpe: begin evacuation. Executing an evacuation off an open, fire-swept beach under the sights of an unsilenced enemy was a nightmare. Small, unarmored landing craft headed back toward the shore through a barrage of German artillery and mortar fire. Many landing craft were blown out of the water before reaching the beach. Others were swamped by the weight of dozens of wounded, desperate men trying to climb aboard. On the beach, Canadian officers and soldiers fought heroically to cover the retreat of their comrades. Tank crews from the Calgary Regiment, sitting in their disabled Churchill tanks on the promenade, continued to fire their cannon and machine guns at German emplacements until their ammunition was completely exhausted, sacrificing themselves so that the infantry could reach the rescue boats. Many of those tank crews fought to the last shell and were captured on the sand. At 1 p.m., the last rescue craft pulled away from the beach at Dieppe, leaving behind a scene of quiet, horror-filled devastation. When the final casualty lists were compiled, the numbers were staggering. Of the 4,963 Canadian soldiers who had embarked on the raid, 3,367 were killed, wounded, or captured, a casualty rate of over 68%. More than 900 Canadian soldiers lay dead on the beach or in the shallow waters of the Channel. Another 1,946 were taken prisoner of war, many of them severely wounded, destined to spend the remainder of the conflict in German prison camps. The British Commandos suffered over 250 casualties, while the Royal Navy lost a destroyer, 33 landing craft, and over 500 seamen killed or wounded. The German forces defending Dieppe, by contrast, suffered fewer than 600 total casualties. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the Allied propaganda machine went into overdrive to reframe the catastrophe. Official communiques issued in London and Ottawa described the raid as a successful reconnaissance in force that had achieved its principal objective of testing the Atlantic Wall and gathering invaluable tactical experience. Winston Churchill spoke in Parliament, acknowledging the heavy casualties, but insisting that the raid was a vital preliminary step toward the ultimate liberation of Europe. Lord Louis Mountbatten was particularly aggressive in protecting his reputation and the standing of Combined Operations Headquarters. Mountbatten argued passionately that the lessons learned at Dieppe, paid for in Canadian blood, were essential to the design and success of the Normandy landings on D-Day 2 years later. He famously declared in later years that for every soldier who died at Dieppe, 10 were saved on D-Day. This narrative, that Dieppe was a necessary, albeit costly, laboratory experiment for D-Day, became the official, dominant historical line for decades after the war. Allies pointed to specific technical innovations that emerged directly from the lessons of August 19, 1942. The realization that heavily fortified enemy ports could not be captured by direct assault, leading to the development of artificial mulberry harbors that could be towed across the Channel. The creation of specialized armored vehicles known as Hobart's Funnies to destroy concrete bunkers and clear minefields. The development of specialized landing craft equipped with rockets for heavy naval close support fire, and the realization that absolute Allied air and naval superiority was an absolute prerequisite for any future landing. However, as historical documents, private diaries, and military records were declassified in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a far more critical and nuanced picture of the Dieppe raid emerged. Historians began to question whether the lessons of Dieppe were truly unknown before August 1942, or whether they were basic military principles that had simply been ignored by ambitious planners. Critics pointed out that the necessity of heavy naval gunfire support and aerial bombardment for amphibious landings had been well understood since Gallipoli in 1915, and had already been demonstrated by the U.S. Marine Corps in the Pacific. The danger of landing directly in front of a fortified port was already standard doctrine in military staff colleges. Furthermore, senior British commanders, including General Montgomery and senior air staff officers, had explicitly warned against the fundamental flaws in the Rudder plan before it was launched. In recent years, archival research by military historians has uncovered an even more intriguing hidden dimension to Operation Jubilee: the ultra-intelligence connection and the hunt for the Enigma machine. During 1942, the German Navy had introduced a new four-rotor Enigma code machine, codenamed Triton by the Germans and Shark by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, for its U-boat fleet in the Atlantic. This new machine had blinded Allied intelligence, preventing Bletchley Park from reading German naval communications and causing catastrophic shipping losses in the Battle of the Atlantic. Intelligence historians, such as David O'Keefe, revealed evidence that a secret pinch operation was embedded within the Dieppe raid. A specialized intelligence unit, Ian Fleming's 30 Assault Unit, was attached to the raid with the covert objective of infiltrating the German naval headquarters in Dieppe during the chaos of the landing, seizing the 4-rotor Enigma machine, codebooks, and setting sheets, and secretly whisking them back to England. According to this perspective, the raid on Dieppe was not merely a tactical test or a strategic demonstration for Stalin, but a high-stakes cover story for a vital intelligence heist that could turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic. However, because the Canadian forces on the beach were pinned down and unable to break into the town, the intelligence team never reached the German naval headquarters, and the secret mission failed completely. Whether viewed as a tragic strategic experiment, a victim of bureaucratic hubris, or a failed intelligence heist, the raid on Dieppe remains one of the most poignant and controversial tragedies in modern military history. For the nation of Canada, Dieppe became an enduring symbol of national sacrifice and resilience. Entire communities across Canada, from Hamilton and Windsor to Montreal and Calgary, were shattered by the loss of an entire generation of young men in a single morning. The sacrifice of those soldiers on the flint pebbles of Normandy left a scar on the national consciousness that remains to this day. When Allied armies finally returned to Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, they did not attack a fortified port. They landed on wide, open beaches far from major harbor installations. They were preceded by thousands of heavy bombers that pounded enemy defenses, covered by the massive 15-inch guns of battleships and heavy cruisers, and supported by specialized armored vehicles designed to cross any terrain. On September 1, 1944, 2 years after the catastrophe, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division marched back into Dieppe. This time, they did not come from landing craft under heavy fire. They arrived from the landward side, pursuing a retreating German army. The German garrison in the town surrendered without a major fight. The Canadian soldiers walked quietly down to the stony shore where so many of their comrades had fallen 24 months earlier. The concrete bunkers on the cliffs were abandoned. The smashed landing craft had been cleared away, and the gray flint pebbles were still rolled by the tide, smoothing over the memory of a morning when brave men were sent into an impossible trap, a trap that military command had been warned against, but chose to execute anyway.